What's up, everybody? From Nautilus Magazine, I'm Associate Editor Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today, we're talking with William A. Harris. He's Professor Emeritus at the University of Cambridge and author recently of Zero to Birth, How to Build a Brain. William, how are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you for having me.
So before we start discussing how the brain develops, I want to ask you why you think brains exist at all. How come we're not all just brainless plants on planet Earth?
Well, it's a good question. A friend of mine named Daniel Wolpert, who's a computational neuroscientist here at Cambridge, says that the only reason to have a brain is so that we can move, so we can control our actions. Neurons control muscles, allowing animals to act. If there's no movement, there's no need for a brain. And he gives the example of tunicates or sea squirts, which in their larval life roam around and they have a little brain, but when they turn into adults, they settle down, attached to a rock, and never move again. And he says the first thing they do then is they digest their own brains. So if you aren't going to take any action on the world, you don't need brains. Well, that's his view. He's particularly interested in the control of movement. Maybe he's a little biased. Some plants move rapidly, Venus flytraps, for example, and some animals don't have brains, like little trichoplax. Ancient animals or sponges don't have brains. Jellyfish don't have brains, but they have neurons. They have things called nerve nets. Now, neurons may coalesce in some areas of the body. In bilateral animals like us and worms, the largest coalescence is at the front end or the head of the animal, which becomes known as the brain. And why do brains exist at all in animals? It, it's a it's a it's a theoretical question, but you'd say, according to evolutionary theory, brains exist because they provide a selective advantage to the species that have them. So over time, over evolutionary time, animals with brains became common here on the planet.
So it proved to
How's that sound?
be an advantage for whatever reason to be able to move around, to presumably to find sources of energy and
Yeah, to
things like that.
to move, to find food, to avoid getting predated, to outsmart the environment and find a mate and reproduce.
You write that the biography of a neuron is full of drama. What's so dramatic about the life of a neuron?
Well, okay, I'll tell you a little story. There's this little baby. Let's call him Billy after me. There's a backstory to this about Billy's mom and why she decided to have Billy write in this particular part of the world. Part of the reason was she was intrinsically attracted to a more tropical climate, perhaps. But as a child, Billy developed connections with other youngsters. And as they entered their teens, Billy became actively engaged and excited about finding a purpose in life. He wanted to get a job and join the big enterprise. But jobs were hard to get. Food was scarce. Billy and his friends got involved in a series of life or death battles. About half of his friends died. Billy survived, though, and he struggled to hang on to his surviving friends. And as Billy became an adult, he became an increasingly useful and dependable and respected member of the team. Wasn't it Billy who sounded the first warning that saved the entire enterprise from destruction? So I would suggest that Billy's life story is based on the biography of a neuron. So is that dramatic enough?
Perhaps, yeah. How could you put it into terms of what the neuron is going through, how it is changing its function and what it's doing as it's perhaps developing in an embryo and dividing and so forth.
Well, it's the parents that are producing the neuron. A neuron, once it's born, doesn't divide anymore, but it does have to find a particular job to do in the brain. And to do that, it has to send out processes. It has to send out connections, little electrical wires, so that it can talk to other neurons that become, the ones that it communicates with, and processes information that come in through these from these other neurons, and it sends out its information to other areas. Um, so it has to mature. It has to develop a particular anatomy and a particular physiology so that it can communicate well. And then over the lifetime of the animal, it changes more subtly. It adjusts these connections. It tunes in to being a particularly useful um, cell in the brain that processes its information as it should.
Hmm.
Does that help?
So, yeah. What do we know by now about how the human brain develops in the womb when we start out as an embryo? How does it all get put together?
That's the whole book. You have to read the book. I can't answer that question in a minute here, but yeah, that's what happens. First, some cells um, start dividing, and in the embryo, and some of those cells become the founders of the nervous system. Those cells then are like the Adams and Eves of the brain, and they produce a whole uh, mass of cells that will eventually turn into uh, adult neurons. The adult neurons then are connecting to each other, and all this is happening in the womb. So when a baby human is born, it already has all the connections, all the neurons that it will ever have in its brain, except for maybe a few, but most of the neurons, and most of them have already connected up in a primary way. Um, and then there's going to be some loss of neurons as they fight with each other to make the team. And then they adjust themselves over time to become the particular neurons that they are. And yeah, all this is happening. Most of it's happening in the womb. The last bit of it's happening outside the womb, particularly in the cortex, although the rest of the brain is probably not changed that, doesn't change that much after exit from the womb.
Is there any kind of process of natural selection going on as the brain is developing?
Well, neurons that don't make good connections tend to die. Neurons that make inappropriate connections retract those tend to retract those connections. So if you call that natural selection, it's not selection in the same way that we talk about Darwinian selection. But yes, synapses are getting selected, neurons are getting selected. Some are making it, some aren't. About half of the synapses we originally make are gone, and about half of the neurons that we originally make die.
So we recently excerpted a piece of your book and we gave it a
Mm.
title of No Two Human Brains Are Alike. And one of the things that you focus on in that piece is how language is one of the things that we talk about when we talk about what are the defining traits of humanity. But of course, other animals communicate. Is there anything special about our brains that makes human language particularly special? Or do animals have the same brain regions as we do for language?
Yeah, well, if you think about communication between individuals as a form of language, then all animals and even plants can talk to each other in their own ways. But human language is a very sophisticated form of communication in terms of its phonemes, all the sounds we can make, the syntax, the grammar, and the complexity. Um, Monkeys, squirrels, birds, and humans all have some areas in our brains for vocal communication. And there are lots of homologies between these areas. So chimpanzees have a Broca's area, which we use for producing language, for example. There might be some differences, like we have what's called a visual word form area, where we can recognize the written word. Not sure that whether a chimpanzee has such an area or not, or if they do, if it's used for recognizing something else. But there are homologies between these areas. What's different is that the relative sizes of these areas in different animals, and the circuitry and processing power of these areas. So I think yes, the answer is yes. You know, the ability to speak evolved naturally from areas in the brain that were already there, but they increased and became more powerful for language in humans, so that we can do these, so that we have a more sophisticated language than most animals or all animals.
Mm. What is it about the young brain of a human that makes it absorb language much more proficiently so that there's nothing like a strong accent after learning the language?
Hmm. Well, I don't think that's been investigated in any detail, but I guess it's likely due to the plasticity of the parts of the brain involved in decoding and producing language. And by plasticity, I mean the molding of the neurons involved, the tuning of their connections. As time marches on and the neurons tune in to a particular language, they become more refractory to changing, to being remolded, and the brain gradually loses its plasticity, or the parts of the brain involved in producing language and understanding language start to lose their plasticity. So we don't really know. It hasn't been investigated in detail. That's just a likely. It's a my guess of what's likely happening.
There's something special too about learning language in that critical period of youth. I mean,
Mm.
children seem to be very proficient at picking up a lot of things when they're really young, and it seems harder in general to learn new skills when we're older. Is that because the brain's plasticity as we age just decreases, becomes less open to new ways of doing things?
Yeah, there are periods, and it's been particularly studied in the visual system and the sensory systems more, where it's found that in youth, neurons are a bit more plastic. They can change their morphology, they can change their connectivity, uh, but it doesn't happen so much in adults. What happens in adults is the connections are all there, and some can be made stronger and some could be made weaker. Maybe you lose some connections and maybe you make some new connections, but not nearly at the rate that happens in as a child. And different parts of the brain, um, you say, develop, mature at different times. So the visual cortex, gets needs experience to tune into the world during early life, very early life, and language similarly. But some parts of the brain are more plastic later in life, or
Hmm.
maintain a plasticity into late life. But by and large, most neurons tune in and get refined during early life.
What's an example of a brain region that remains relatively plastic later on in life?
I guess some of and this is not my area of expertise, but some of the frontal areas of the cortex that are involved in high level decision making, for example.
Okay, that sounds helpful. You write that the visual cortex need not be quote unquote visual, and this in fact may be true for every area of the cortex. Does that mean that our brain doesn't really have parts specialized for certain things? It seems like it does. How do you make sense of that?
Well, I don't say that the visual cortex is not specialized for vision. It is, but people that are born blind, in people that are born blind, it can be used for hearing, for somatosensation, for language even. And how does the visual cortex do this? Again, I'm going to say we don't know. It processes information in a way that is still largely mysterious. It processes information in its neurons and it sends the output of that processing to other areas in the brain which use this information. So the question is really, how does each region of the cortex process information? I'm going to give you an example of an experiment done by Doug Frost and colleagues at MIT using neurosurgical techniques on newborn hamsters. They forced the visual pathway into the auditory cortex. And then they recorded from the neurons in the auditory cortex and found that they were processing and making sense of visual instead of auditory input. In other words, you could say maybe that they were hearing what the images that were coming in through their eyes. So the auditory cortex was processing visual information. Uh, it's no doubt that the auditory cortex is tuned to work better with auditory input than visual input. And the visual cortex probably works best with visual input. But if the information can get in there, it gets processed and possibly in a useful way.
Wow. So, what do you make of brain machine interface technology nowadays? Do you think it's technologically possible to significantly increase our brain power? I mean, that's the end game for companies like Neuralink. Are they onto something?
I don't know. Building a brain is tremendously complicated. There's 100 billion neurons approximately, and they're connected in a very particular and well-tuned way with 100 trillion adjustable synapses in a tiny space. Brains evolved since the dawn of animal life, and brain power comes from how you put a brain together. And that mostly happens during development. And how then it's tuned by experience. Neuralink, as I understand, uses probes to listen to parts of the brain, and the output of those probes control things like communication devices or robots. And this can be used to restore movement to patients with paralysis, or it could be used in the future, for example, to restore vision to or visual input into the visual cortex of someone who's become blind as an adult. So, yeah, I don't know about improving brain power because that's I think it's a question of how the brain was built during development. But Neuralink can tune into the brain and do stuff that is based on the activity of the brain that might be useful.
Yeah. So, where my mind goes when I think about this sort of thing is neural prosthetics. From what I understand, if you have, um, you say you have to have your arm removed and you get a replacement that can has some kind of computer on board in it, and it can connect to your brain, and you can control your prosthetic arm with your brain. Could there be a kind of cognitive prosthesis that you can control using your brain in a similar way? You're not controlling an arm, but perhaps you're controlling some other digital device. that can allow you to communicate on the internet or search the internet or something like that. It seems like in principle possible, but yeah, I have no idea how one might make that or
Yeah,
something
if you
like
could
that.
get
Yeah.
a neural link in there to understand a thought like multiply 31,497, take its square root, and divide it by the fourth 400th largest prime number, and you could tell that to a computer through a neural link, then the computer could give you the answer, which you couldn't do with your own brain.
Do you see? I mean, I think the mission of a company like Neuralink is to ward off the possibility that AI might overcome or supersede human intelligence. And so this is a way that we can play keep up or catch up so that we're not overcome by rampant AI.
Yeah, I mean that's beyond me. I'm a developmental neurobiologist. I'm not going to speculate, but some people are worried about AI, and I can understand why. I mean, you've got a computer that can beat a human at chess. Um, will they ever, become whatever it was that in the Arnold Schwarzenegger movies became decided to rise up and take over? I don't know if that'll happen.
Well, once again, I'm with William Harris, and your new book is out. It's called Zero to Birth: How to Build a Brain. Is there anything else you'd like to close on, William? Any more closing thoughts or ways our viewers can find you online and see more of your stuff?
Well, I don't really have a lot more stuff. I've got a textbook that I used to use for teaching undergraduates. Um, I'm retired. I wrote this book because I studied this topic throughout my career and was fascinated by the way the most complicated thing in the known world was made. We still don't know a lot about that, and we still don't know a lot about how it works. Um, but if you're interested in the basic principles in a language that I try to use without a whole lot of you know biological language, have a look at the book and hope you like it.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much.